Chris Trump for KaijuPop.com, and welcome to This Month in Gaming History as we look back 20 years to April of 1995. It was a busy spring for games, but to start things off wasn't a software release, but a hardware one. Nintendo put out their somewhat bizarre Satellaview this month. Only in Japan, this was a satellite modem of sorts for the Super Famicom. It clipped in the expansion slot that was initially designed to hold the PlayStation CD drive before that whole deal went south. Somewhat similar to Sega's Sega Channel for the Genesis come Mega Drive in the United States, this was the result of a partnership between Nintendo and satellite broadcaster WoW. The idea was that you would have this attached to your Super Famicom and be able to gain access to games on a subscription basis that were broadcast on a specific satellite channel. Unlike the Sega Channel, where you could only play the games while you had while you were connected to the service, with Satellaview you could even save games to specific blank cartridges that you were able to pick up. You were also able to download data to those blank cartridges at convenience stores. While a lot of the fare was similar to what you had with Sega Channel, a subscription service offering up certain older Super Famicom games, things like F-Zero and the like, there were also specific games created just for the service, a Darby Stallion game, and most famously BS Zelda, which took the Link to the Past engine and gave new quests and new content that were broadcast on specific times of day. If you weren't around at that time of day, well, you missed out on that day's episode. So because of that, it's been incredibly difficult for archivists to sort of track down all the individual parts of BS Zelda and cobble it together, and a lot's missing from that era. But still, the Satellaview was a really interesting little service that did surprisingly well for Nintendo. In fact, this was supported all the way up until the year 2000, where it was sort of replaced in the crazy accessory sticks by Nintendo's own 64DD. The Satellaview was Nintendo's bid to squeeze an extra little bit of life out the Super Famicom, as they knew that the Nintendo 64 was likely going to be pushed back into 1996 and missed 95 altogether. Sega and Sony's new generation of hardware was starting to find its feet after a slow opening to the year. The Saturn had a couple of big releases this month, leading the way Daytona USA, a port of their arcade game that had been shown off right from the very start when the Saturn made its Consumer Electronics Show debut. It was an enjoyable enough racer, but a kind of a poor port from the arcade game. Really showed up with some bad frame rate issues and some terrible pop-up, and the only thing that was an improvement over the arcade was sort of remixed CD sound and the infamous Mitsuyoshi Takenobu rendition of this song. The soundtrack so wonderfully cheesy that when Daytona USA was released as an HD remake for PSP and P60, it even had a karaoke mode embedded into it. The draw distance issue and the frame rate stuff would be fixed later on with a championship edition a year further on, but it still wasn't the best racer and it wasn't the best arcade port. It sort of showed the difficulties along with Virtua Fighter of how hard it was to bring arcade ports to the Sega Saturn, and the PlayStation definitely had the better arcade racer in the form of launch title Ridge Racer. But still, Daytona USA was pretty good, and it was definitely the better big Saturn release this month, as also joining Daytona USA was Virtual High-Glide from Atlas and T&E Soft. Virtual High-Glide was a remake of the MSX game High-Glide that was also brought over to the NES, and it was one of those answers to a question that nobody asked. High-Glide was reasonably well thought of, but for what reason it's hard to say. It was a top-down RPG in the Ultima vein, when Japan was very much obsessed with the Ultima games, that had kind of more of an action RPG edge. It had real-time combat, so to speak. You would sort of run into enemies to kill them. But it was sort of very well known for being incredibly obtuse and having the worst Indiana Jones knockoff music of all time. Well, Virtual Highlight was a remake of that. It put everything into 3D, if you could call it that. We're talking about 3D environments with frame rates that typically were in the single figures and with digitized sprites overlaid upon them. It was kind of altered structurally with a lot of random elements that would be popular with the roguelikes of today, but just the actual game was utterly appalling. So definitely there was, despite a couple of big Saturn releases, only one was any good this month.
The safety of peaceful worlds.
On the PlayStation front, you could go for some bizarre first-person platforming. Jumping Flash was a developed project that started as a tech demo called Springman, a first-person platformer where you were controlled a guy with springs on his feet. So Jumping Flash took that unsellable concept, of course, and turned Springman into Robbit, who was a robotic rabbit. Yeah. So it was kind of weird. You would jump around these self-contained worlds and collect carrots. It was a really good showcase for what the PlayStation could do in terms of 3D, and even though it never got the sales that it truly deserved, it did enough to warrant a sequel. Most interesting was the fact that it was a sort of puzzle platformer. Knowing that it was difficult to pull off platforming in first person, it got around that by having more of a puzzling approach, and it was surprisingly playable. It had decent little tricks to it, like Robert being able to look down at his feet in order to gauge distance when he was jumping. It was a pretty cool game. Another pretty cool PS1 exclusive this month was Gunner's Heaven. It would later be released in Europe as Rapid Reload, but Gunner's Heaven never made it to the States, presumably because the thinking being within Sony that this was now the 3D era and nobody in America wanted to play a sprite-based game. But still, MediaVision's Run and Gunner was a really enjoyable little 2D blaster with a lot of references to Treasure's Gunstar Heroes. Speaking of Treasure, who developed Gunstar Heroes a couple of years prior, put out their second game of the year. After Alien Soldier came Light Crusader, again on Sega's humble Mega Drive. Light Crusader was a bit of departure from Treasure's earlier outings. It wasn't an arcadey, characterful action game. Instead, it was an action RPG with a lot of nods to the old isometric RPGs like Ultima and Rare's Nightlore, among others. It was a definite change of pace and not particularly well received. You had the sort of isometric issues that common to a lot of these games. It was very difficult to control your guy, and it also just had bizarre nature to it. Every single person or object in the game wasn't so much an animated character as almost like a figure on a board, which perhaps was the style they were going for, but it meant you could push people around and off ledges and the like. It was a little bit aimless, but it had its fans, and it was definitely a departure from what Treasure was used to producing, but perhaps due to a lack of sales, Treasure will get back to quirky arcade action soon enough. The Mega Drive was having its light system steadily turned off, but there were still a few more games left in it. Primarily the 32X. The 32X being plugged into the Mega Drive made it look like it was on life support with all the cables jutting out of it. And, the 32X itself was already significantly ailing. But it had a couple of big games this month. Knuckles Chaotix or just Chaotix in Japan, was the closest that Sega fans would get to a proper Sonic game on the system, and indeed in the entire 32-bit era. It sort of had a bizarre approach where you were choosing two characters that would be chained together, and you would use each individual momentum to propel you to higher places and the like. And then there were more sort of flashy 3D polygonal based bonus stages in between levels. Well, there were fans that would hold this as 32X's killer app, but there weren't many 32X fans to begin with, so, you know. There was also Romance of the Three Kingdoms on 32X, as well as Mega Drive a little bit later on. But, well, if you're a Romance of the Three Kingdoms fan, you are more likely to get this on your new fancy CD systems, which had FMV to bulk it up, but the cartridge version was just fine. The cartridge version of Mortal Kombat 3 would be just fine as well when it came to 16-bit systems later in the year, but for now, Midway's third brutal arcade fighter came out in the arcades this month. 3 saw Mortal Kombat continue its slide into tongue-in-cheek self-parody. After Mortal Kombat 1 was fairly self-serious for the most part, the Mortal Kombat 2 with its friendships and rivalry injected a little bit of humor. Mortal Kombat 3 was by now completely ridiculous, offering brutalities, massive combos that saw your opponents explode in a jet of blood and guts in just ridiculous finishing moves and all sorts in between. Mortal Kombat 3 was really kind of a bit of a joke and a little bit of fun, which meant that it had its own sort of niche by this point. Whereas Mortal Kombat 1, where compared directly to something like Street Fighter, could never really compete as a technical fighting game. It could compete in terms of character, and Mortal Kombat 3 was fairly likable. It also added a few little flashy extras like stage transitions and being able to continue the fight after cutting someone through ceilings or pushing them off roofs and the like. It was an enjoyable little arcade fighter. But it wasn't all about consoles in the arcades this month, as it was a fairly big month for computers as well. Take the already pretty much dead Amiga, which was by now home to fans of nostalgia and hobbyists, really, at this point, but still had a few good games coming out. Acid Software, for instance, putting out Super Skid Marks on the system this month, the sequel to their fun, sort of isometric Ivan Stewart's off-road homage Skid Marks. This was a game that was even more fun, offering up to an incredible 8 players if you had enough computers and LAN cables going around, racing in comedic off-road races that allowed for more cars, more tracks, and more comedy, again, with minis competing against motorized cows, amongst other things. There was also Exile, a remake of a 1986 Commodore 64 title. Exile saw you stranded on an alien planet, trying to escape armed with nothing but a jetpack and your wits. The original game had come out around the same time as Metroid was hitting Famicom's and NES's, and to the home computer crowd in Europe, this game was to them what Metroid was to Famicom and NES players in America and in Japan. It had a unique sort of sense of alien otherworldliness and this unique feeling of isolation and terror, light horror, even though there was the usual sort of European video game humor attached to it as well. It was a tricky one to get to grips with, especially as you weren't directed and just left to your own devices to try and figure out what you were supposed to do. But it was really kind of seminal and important game that's kind of very often and sadly forgotten about. This remake saw the original game being able to be played on 32-bit Amiga's CD32, A1200 and the like, which is good because it was one of those rare Amiga games, the Amiga port of the original Exile, was one of the rare games that couldn't run on more powerful machines. So it was that, but sadly it wasn't as good as the original was. Part of the big deal with the original Exile was highlighting the size and the scope of the world, and it did that with deliberately small graphics, having you as a tiny little spacesuit-clad man flying across these alien landscapes. And that also let you plan out what you were trying to do, and it made navigation a lot easier. Here the idea was, well, let's show off our new graphics. So the cute little spaceman isolated on this strange alien world was now a kind of more buff space marine type, and everything was much more zoomed in, which made the game harder to play, if anything. But still, it was a chance for a new generation perhaps to play Exile, but by this point everybody had moved on from the Amiga, so yes, it was forgotten, which is a great shame. And then there were a couple of DOS games to finish us up this month. First of all, speaking of isolation in strange alien landscapes, we had First Encounters. Frontier First Encounters was Elite 3. Bear with us here. So there was Elite, then there was Frontier, Elite 2, and then there was Frontier First Encounters. So it didn't have Elite in the title, but it was still by Frontier Developments and David Braben. And it was the same sort of idea of setting you loose on the galaxy, which was all procedurally generated. This time it had procedurally generated landscapes on each of the planets that you visited. So really, in a real sort of long before No Man's Sky was ever close to coming out, it had that idea of procedurally generating mountains and valleys on planets themselves, as well as the entire galaxy. So it's a huge in scope, and to sort of put an emphasis on exploration, there was less in the way of trading and less in the way of missions, and it was more about, hey, fly around and explore. There were also, because this was the mid-90s and this was a PC game on CDs, there were FMV sequences to break everything up with characters explaining stuff to you. So, well, perhaps it was even more aimless than the first two Elite games, which sort of polarized and divided audiences because of that. But a more major problem was that First Encounters had a sizable amount of bugs in its initial release, which meant that the third game in the Elite series, was forgotten about and moved on quickly from, and Elite wouldn't return until Dangerous 20 years later. Finally was Full Throttle, Tim Schafer and LucasArts' latest point-and-click adventure. Was one of the last to use the 2D SCUM engine, and kind of had a darker approach perhaps than Monkey Island and the like. Rather than following cartoonish pirates, here you were following a futuristic biker gang with a slightly darker tale to it, but it definitely still had Tim Schafer's trademark sense of humor, and was well regarded, and by many people feel that this was one of the best, if not the best, LucasArts adventures to come out. It was influential enough for a series of sequels to make it some way into development, and only to get shut down. So perhaps today, in the days of Grim Fandango being re-released to people and Day of the Tentacle, soon to be re-released to a new generation of gamers as well, perhaps it would be nice to see Full Throttle make a reappearance sometime too. So that's April 1995 in a nutshell. For more on the events of April 1985, 1995, and 2005, check out the full written and video this month in video gaming history on kaijupop.com.